Martha's weathered hands trembled as she pressed her back against the cabin wall, listening to the thunder of approaching hooves. Through the window, she glimpsed the gleam of rifle barrels and the hard faces of men who'd come to take everything. Her heart hammered against her ribs. After 15 years of solitude, death had finally found her remote homestead. Then, from the ridge above, came the haunting call of a hawk that sounded almost human. Martha Hendricks pressed her weathered hands against the wagon's wooden seat as Cedar Ridge came into view through the desert heat. 52 years old and 3 years widowed, she'd made this same journey every week since Samuel's death. The dusty frontier town looked smaller each time she visited, like it was slowly disappearing into the Arizona landscape. Her green eyes, carved deep with grief lines, scanned the familiar storefronts, the general store, the saloon, the church that hadn't seen a proper preacher in months. Nothing ever changed here, which suited Martha just fine. Change had taken everything she loved already. She guided her horses toward the hitching post near Murphy's store, mentally checking her supply list. Flour, coffee, lamp oil. Simple needs for a simple life, the kind of life that kept her heart beating without asking it to feel much else. But today was different. A crowd had gathered in the town square, their voices rising like angry wasps. Martha's horses sensed the tension, ears flicking nervously as she pulled them to a stop. Through the press of bodies, she caught glimpses of something that made her stomach clench. A boy. Couldn't be more than 12 years old. Tied to the hitching post like an animal. Apache, by the look of him, with dark eyes that burned with terror and defiance in equal measure. The crowd circled him like vultures, their accusations cutting through the desert air. Caught him with Henderson's horses. Thieving savage! Should string him up right here. Martha had seen that look before. Pure desperation. The same expression that had stared back at her from her mirror after Samuel's funeral, when the world felt like it was closing in from all sides. Her chest tightened as she watched the boy's small shoulders shake, not from fear, but from rage at his helplessness. Sheriff Bradley stood at the crowd's edge, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. His badge might as well have been made of paper for all the authority he was willing to use. Martha knew that look too, the careful calculation of a man who'd rather keep his job than his conscience. Well, conscience was something she still had plenty of. The crowd's bloodlust grew louder. Someone mentioned rope. Another voice suggested making an example. The boy's eyes darted between faces, searching for mercy he wouldn't find. Martha's hands trembled as something primal awakened in her chest, something she hadn't felt since Samuel died. Without thinking, without calculating consequences, she climbed down from her wagon. Her legs felt unsteady, but her voice came out strong and clear as she pushed through the mob. "That's my hired hand you're harassing." The crowd turned toward her like a single organism. Pike, the cruelest man in 3 counties, stepped forward with his yellow teeth bared in what might have been a smile. "You're what now, Martha?" "My hired hand." The lie rolled off her tongue smooth as creek water. "I sent him to retrieve my horses from Henderson's place. Had them grazing on shared pasture all week." Doubt crept into the crowd's certainty like water through cracked stone. Martha's reputation for honesty preceded her, and everyone knew she'd been Samuel's partner in every decision for 20 years. If Martha Hendricks said something, people generally believed it. But Pike wasn't people. His eyes narrowed as he studied her face, looking for cracks in her story. Funny how Henderson didn't mention any arrangement. "Henderson's been drunk for 3 days straight." Martha met his stare without blinking. "Ask him tomorrow when he sobers up." The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Pike spat in the dirt and waved his hand dismissively. "You're harboring a savage, Martha. Don't come crying to us when he scalps you in your sleep." The crowd dispersed, disappointed by the lack of violence. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs as she untied the boy's bonds, wondering what exactly she'd just gotten herself into. But as they rode toward her homestead in tense silence, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next would be better than living with the alternative. The wagon ride home stretched like a taut wire between 2 people who couldn't speak each other's language. Martha kept her eyes on the dusty trail ahead, while the Apache boy, Ayanna, she'd learn later, sat rigid beside her, every muscle coiled for escape. His dark eyes swept the landscape constantly, cataloging rocks and gullies and places where a person might disappear if things went wrong. Martha couldn't blame him. She was having second thoughts herself. What exactly had she done back there? Lied to a mob to save a boy she didn't know, from a people most folks called enemies. Samuel would have called it foolish. Then again, Samuel had always been the practical one. Maybe that's why she'd acted on impulse, because practicality had died with him 3 years ago. The homestead came into view as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Her small cabin looked even smaller with another person to consider. The barn, the corral, the vegetable garden she'd fought to keep alive. Everything would change now. Had to change. Ayana's head turned as they approached, taking in every detail. The well positioned near the house, the rifle leaning by the door, the best vantage points and escape routes. Smart kid. Martha found herself respecting that wariness, even as it reminded her how little trust existed between them. She climbed down from the wagon and gestured toward the barn. Work first, understanding later, that had always been her way. The next weeks unfolded like a careful dance between two wary partners. Martha showed him how to mend fences, her weathered hands guiding his younger ones along the wire, how to milk the stubborn cow that kicked anyone who approached wrong, how to check the horses for stones in their hoofs and cuts that could fester in the desert heat. But Ayana taught her things too, things that made her realize how much she'd been struggling alone. He showed her tracks in the dirt that she'd never noticed, not just obvious hoof prints, but the subtle signs that told stories. How disturbed pebbles revealed which direction a jackrabbit had fled. How the depth of a coyote's paw print indicated whether it was hunting or just passing through. Information that could mean the difference between losing livestock and keeping them safe. When Martha's mare went lame, Ayana disappeared for an hour and returned with plants she'd never seen. He made a poultice that reduced the swelling better than anything she could have managed. The horse was walking normally within 2 days. Makes sense, right? Here she'd been thinking she knew her own land, and this boy could read it like a book written in a language she'd never learned. Their communication evolved slowly. Martha would point to objects and say their English names. Ayana would respond with Apache words that sounded like wind through canyon walls. Water became tu. Horse became we. Her tongue stumbled over the unfamiliar sounds, but his eyes showed patience she hadn't expected. Then there were the English lessons. Martha discovered that Ayana picked up her language faster than she learned his. Within a month, he could string together basic sentences. Fence need fix. Cow sick today. Storm come tomorrow. And the weird part is, he was usually right about the weather. Apache children learned to read the sky like Martha read her Bible. Cloud formations that looked identical to her told Ayana whether rain would arrive in hours or days. Wind patterns revealed temperature changes coming from hundreds of miles away. Birds behaved differently before storms, and he noticed details that escaped her completely. The seasons changed around their growing partnership. Summer's brutal heat gave way to autumn's crisp mornings. Ayana helped her prepare for winter in ways she'd never considered. Which firewood burned hottest. How to preserve meat using methods his people had perfected over generations. Where to find medicinal plants before the first frost killed them. But sometimes he would disappear. Martha would wake to find his blankets empty, no sign of where he'd gone. The first time, panic seized her chest. Had he finally run away? Had something happened to him? She spent the day scanning the horizon, jumping at every shadow. He returned at sunset with fresh meat and that look in his eyes, the one. That said, he'd been somewhere she couldn't follow, somewhere that connected him to his people and their ways. Martha never asked where he went during those absences. She understood the pull of heritage, even if hers looked different from his. Everyone needed roots, needed to remember who they were beneath the daily work of survival. Years passed like desert seasons, harsh and beautiful and full of quiet revelations. Ayana grew taller, his shoulders broadening as he took on heavier work around the homestead. But he never lost that careful awareness, that ability to read danger in the wind's direction or the behavior of distant birds. Their conversations deepened as his English improved. He told her about Apache traditions, about the importance of living in harmony with the land, rather than trying to conquer it. Martha shared stories about Samuel, about the dreams they'd built together before death stole half of everything she'd ever wanted. Well, maybe she'd found something else worth wanting. Not the same as what she'd lost, but valuable in its own way. Family didn't always look like what people expected. The morning Ayanna turned 18, Martha woke to find him sitting on the porch steps, staring toward the distant mountains. Something in his posture told her this day would be different from all the others. "I must go back," he said when she joined him with 2 cups of coffee. His English had become nearly perfect over the years, touched with the same precise way of speaking that Samuel had always admired in educated men. Martha's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "I know. My people need me, and I need them." He looked at her with eyes that held both regret and determination. "But I will never forget what you did, how you saved me, how you treated me like family." That afternoon, Martha saddled Samuel's horse and loaded the saddlebags with supplies. She pressed Samuel's rifle into Ayanna's hands, the one her husband had carried through 2 Apache conflicts, back when the world seemed more divided than it did now. "Take care of yourself," she said, surprised by how steady her voice remained. "And you take care of yourself, Martha Hendricks." Ayanna swung up onto the horse with fluid grace. "The Apache have long memories. What you did for me, we remember." He rode toward the mountains without looking back, leaving Martha alone on the homestead once again. But somehow, the solitude felt different now, less empty. She'd learned that family could grow in unexpected places, take shapes nobody planned for. She had no idea how important that lesson would become, or how soon she'd need the protection that long Apache memories might provide. 5 years of peaceful mornings shattered like glass when Martha spotted dust clouds on the horizon. 3 riders approached her homestead with the kind of confidence that spelled trouble. Their horses moved at an unhurried pace, the gait of men who knew they held all the cards. Martha set down her coffee cup and reached for Samuel's old spyglass. Hard faces, official-looking papers tucked in saddlebags, guns worn low and easy. Her stomach dropped as recognition hit her. She'd seen their type before in Cedar Ridge. Men who solved problems with intimidation and left widows counting their losses. The leader dismounted first. Tall, lean, with eyes like winter stones. His smile reminded Martha of Pike's yellow-toothed grin from years ago. But this man carried himself with educated menace. "Mrs. Hendricks, name's Garrett." He touched his hat brim in mock politeness. "I'm afraid we have some unpleasant business to discuss." The papers he produced looked legitimate enough. Official seals, fancy letterhead, Samuel's signature at the bottom. According to the documents, her husband had borrowed substantial money from Eastern creditors, using the homestead as collateral. The debt remained unpaid 3 years after his death, and they'd come to collect. "Samuel never gambled." Martha's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Never borrowed money from anyone." Garrett's smile widened. "Desperate men do desperate things, ma'am. Your husband got in deep with some poker games before he died. This here paper proves it. But something felt wrong about the whole situation. Samuel had been many things: stubborn, occasionally foolish, prone to fixing problems himself instead of asking for help. A gambler wasn't one of them. He'd barely touched whiskey, let alone cards. Then there was the timing. Why wait 3 years to collect? Why approach her directly instead of working through the territorial courts? And why did Garrett's companions keep scanning the horizon like they expected trouble? Makes sense now, doesn't it? They weren't just collecting debts. They were stealing land using forged documents, and Martha was the only witness who might expose their scheme. "You've got 1 week to vacate," Garrett announced, folding the papers with theatrical precision. "Pack what you can carry, leave the rest. And if I refuse? Well, now, that wouldn't be wise." His tone remained conversational, but ice crept into those winter eyes. Accidents happen to folks who don't cooperate, especially isolated folks living all alone. The threat hung in the desert air like heat shimmer. After the men rode away, Martha stood in her doorway trying to process what had just happened. 25 years of building this place, and 3 strangers with fake papers wanted to steal it all. She spent the next few days preparing for war, cleaned her rifle until it gleamed, counted ammunition, rationed supplies, studied the terrain around her cabin, looking for defensive positions, But who was she kidding? One middle-aged widow against 3 armed men? The mathematics of survival didn't add up in her favor. The appointed day arrived with typical desert indifference. Clear sky, brutal sun, wind that carried dust, and the promise of violence. Martha heard the hoofbeats long before the riders appeared, thunder rolling across the hard pan like approaching doom. She pressed her back against the cabin wall, heart hammering against her ribs. Through the window, rifle barrels gleamed in the morning light, hard faces set with deadly purpose. After 15 years of solitude since Ayanna left, death had finally found her remote homestead. Then something impossible happened. From the ridge above came the haunting call of a hawk. But Martha had lived in this desert long enough to know the difference between bird song and human mimicry. The sound carried notes no hawk throat could produce, pitched in patterns that spoke of intelligence and intent. Her eyes found the silhouette on the skyline. Mounted warrior, rifle across his saddle. Face she'd know anywhere, even after 5 years of separation. Ayanna had come home. The hawk call echoed across the desert one more time before silence settled like dust. Martha watched Ayanna's silhouette against the morning sky, and something shifted in her chest. Fear transformed into something fiercer. She wasn't alone anymore. What happened next was poetry, written in Apache warfare. Garrett and his men approached the cabin with predator confidence, but Ayanna knew every rock, every gully, every hiding spot within a mile of Martha's homestead. He'd spent 6 years learning this land as a boy, and now he used that knowledge like a weapon. The first shot came from the ridge, not aimed to kill, but to wound Garrett's horse. The animal screamed and stumbled, throwing its rider hard into the dirt. Confusion rippled through the group as they tried to locate the shooter. Then Ayanna seemed to be everywhere at once. A second shot from the eastern rocks took out another horse. The third man wheeled his mount toward the sound, only to find empty space and echoing gunfire from the opposite direction. Martha had read about Apache tactics in newspaper accounts, but watching Ayanna orchestrate this deadly dance was something else entirely. He used the terrain like a chess master, appearing and vanishing with fluid precision. His intimate knowledge of every boulder and depression around the homestead turned familiar ground into a maze of death for the would-be thieves. Within 20 minutes, 2 men lay wounded, and Garrett found himself surrounded, his companions' horses scattered across the desert. Ayanna materialized from behind a stand of mesquite, rifle trained on the leader's chest. "Drop your weapons," he said in English that carried no trace of the boy Martha had once saved. This was a grown Apache warrior, and his voice held the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Garrett's winter eyes filled with rage, but he complied. Smart man knew when he'd been outmaneuvered. The truth spilled out quickly enough once Ayanna started asking pointed questions. The gambling debts were fabricated, the documents forged. Garrett's operation had stolen homesteads across 3 territories using the same scheme. Kill the witnesses, claim the land, sell it to Eastern investors who never bothered checking the paperwork's authenticity. Martha watched justice unfold with quiet satisfaction. Her impulsive act of mercy 15 years ago had woven her into something larger than herself. Ayanna explained that Apache scouts had been watching her homestead for months, honoring the woman who'd saved one of their own. As Garrett and his surviving companion rode away under armed escort, Martha and Ayanna stood together in the morning light. The circle had completed itself. Compassion had created bonds that transcended culture and time, providing protection when it mattered most. Sometimes the best family is the one you choose to save.